Takže zdravím vás všetkých, ktorí ste prišli na tento daný livestream. V tomto livestreame to nebude o správach, nebude to o ničom inom, len o FOMCčku. Čiže budeme mať meeting, alebo teda o chvíľočku nám začne meeting, teda o chvíľočku, o hodinku nám začne meeting, ale dáta by sme mali dostať už o nejakej 8 hodine. Zatiaľ teda, a prečo mi to v kuse tu na takto hodí, toto nie je OK, tak to musí to byť. Dobre, o chvíľočku by sme mali dostať dáta, čo sa Fedu týka, čiže uvidíme, že aké správy prídu. Prílišné veľké očakávania teda nemôžeme mať, ešte si natočím jednu stránku. A to je táto stránka, hops. Dobre, čiže o 12 minút sa to všetko rozbehne. Čo sa týka zatiaľ teda dát a správ, tak tie očakávania sú také, že sa nebude navyšovať úrokové sadzby. Hej. Zatiaľ teda market už mám taký pocit, že dáva možno aj price in na to, že sa nebude zdvíhať úrokové sadzby, ale že sa možno ešte aj znížia, keďže sú tu menšie percentá, ale nechce sa mi príliš veľmi tomu veriť, že viacero ľudí proste v to dúfa a v to verí. Čiže zatiaľ teda Bitcoin nerobí nič katastrofálne, nič iné než doposiaľ. Zatiaľ sa stále drží nad hodnotou 21 a to je teda aj na tej 12 hodinovke. Tá rezistencia je celkovo dosť jasná a dosť známa, čo sa týka Bitcoinu, a to je tá vrchná hodnota zhruba nejakých 44 200 $. Čiže tam sa nám zatiaľ teda nič nemení. Otestovali sme si supportovku a prakticky zažívame veľmi pekný odraz. Čiže dneska, čo sa chartu týka, vyzerá to fakt, že dosť priaznivo, minimálne z toho trading pohľadu, ak dokážeme zatvárať nad hodnotou 43 500 $. Môže to byť celkovo dosť dobrá správa. Dneska ale fakt, že extrémny deň, kedy to môže dosť ovplyvňovať market. Čo sa týka indikátory sú stále veľmi pozitívne naladené. Stochastic RSI sú nasmerované smerom hore a Stochastic je v extrémnej bullish zóne, takisto aj VT Cross sa dostáva do bullish zóny, čiže my sme tu prakticky zažili plný reset a následne krásny odraz od hodnoty 200 a pokračujeme smerom hore, čiže zatiaľ to vyzerá tak, že máme fakt, že šance na útok na tú hodnotu rezistencie. Zatiaľ teraz stále sa držíme v tom flagu. Tá hodnota na weekly timeframe je zatváranie nad hodnotou 44 061 $. Čiže toto všetko nám ponúka market, toto všetko nám poskytuje market. My sa teda krásne pripravíme na to, aby sme videli, čo sa udeje na markete. Dáme si 5 minútovku na Bitcoine, nech to tu krásne lieta. Ak to tu vôbec bude lietať, a následne dáme si aj tu na S&P 500 market, dáme si 5 minútovku takisto. Dobre. Čiže uvidíme, že aký priebeh, alebo dám to viac do strany, neviem, že ako vám to vyhovuje, takto, alebo to dáme takto. Takto je to dosť na... Hodíme to takto. A Bitcoin si posunieme tu. Možno bude nejaká väčšia price akcia. Ale zatiaľ teda, alebo dáme to na 15 minútovku. Veľký drop z all time high, toto je celkovo dosť zaujímavé, ale takisto aj Bitcoin na tej 15 minútovke nevyzerá úplne najlepšie a najideálnejšie. Dajte like, ať sme vidieť presne. Dobre, ešte predtým, než sa to spustí, keďže máme ešte 9 minút. Na tých menších timeframoch, alebo na tom menšom timeframe, hlavne teda na 15 minútovke, Bitcoin nie je úplne najideálnejšie prepadáva cez hodnotu 21 a 30. Teraz by som to ale trošička, pardon, to je na 5 minútovke. Teraz by som to ale trošička ignoroval, a to hlavne skrz toho, že tie dáta by to mali trošička rozhýbať. Predsa len keď dostaneme dáta a následne aj Pavel, keď začne rozprávať, tak sa to trošička rozletí, čiže nejaká tá analýzka možno ku koncu videa, ktoré nechcem, aby bolo viac než do 9. Čiže uvidíme, že Pavla asi ani nebudeme mať celého, ale keď, no možno tu vydržím nejakých 9-15, ale neviem, že či to až takto potiahnem. Zatiaľ teda vyzeráme negatívnejšie naladení, pokiaľ nebudeme zatvárať, alebo teda pokiaľ sa nedostaneme naspäť nad hodnotu 43 572 $, tak vyzerá to tak, že by sme mohli vyklesovať práve k tej hodnote 43 200 $ ešte pred dátami, ale upozorňujem, hej, teraz akože keď nemáte skúsenosti s tradingom a nemáte čas na to proste tu vysedávať, tak by som teraz ani príliš veľmi netradoval, aj keď, hej, to celkovo môže šľapať. Čiže tí, čo máte nejaké tie pozície, na 100% určite majte pripravené už stopky v pluse, lebo môže to byť veľmi rýchle, veľmi šialené, aj keď posledné meetingy to tak nebolo, ale predsa sú to len veľké dáta. Dobre, čo sa týka S&P 500 marketu, zatiaľ teda, čo sa týka weekly time frameu, tam nemáme príliš veľmi o čom, lebo si vytvárame nové all-time high a tento market pušuje ďalej a vyššie. Čo sa týka supportovej línie, supportová línia by mala byť teda na tej hodnote $4790, potom ďalšia hodnota je 21, $4600 a pokiaľ S&P 500 market nespadne, pokiaľ nespadne pod hodnotu na weekly timeframe $4136, tak sa nedá príliš veľmi očakávať, že sa dostaneme do nejakého negatíva. Tu nám máme vytvorený jeden low bod, ale ten low bod je len na jednej korekčnej sviečke, čiže ono to nie je ani tak prakticky nejaký low. Ten low je až na tej hodnote $4112, čiže pokiaľ nenarúšame túto líniu a túto úroveň, tak proste sme pozitívni. Čiže aj keby S&P 500 market vyklesalo na 4600, 4500, 4400, 4200 dokonca, vôbec by to nebol problém z toho dlhodobého pohľadu. Čiže zatiaľ S&P 500 market veľmi pekne pozitívny. Čo sa týka 45 minútovky, tu vidíme, že sa nám trošičku láme ten trend. Dnešné otestovanie možno tej hodnoty $4810 alebo teda $11. Zatiaľ teda na 15 minútovke mega diera. Uvidíme, že ako sa to celé rozbehá tu na tomto našom markete. Dobře, čiže toto som presne nechcel. Dáme si to na bitcoiník. Ďakujem vám veľmi pekne všetkým, ktorí ste dali nejaký ten donatík, čiže konkrétne chcem poďakovať. Sekundu, ešte si to nastavím, keďže pôjdeme na dáta. Konkrétne ďakujem veľmi pekne. No, dobře, máme to tak, ako sme to chceli mať. Ináč je tu flag, hej, continuation flag, ktorý by teda mohol ťahať S&P 500 market na nižšie hodnoty. Ups, tak to som nechcel. Dobře, a bitcoiník. Dobre, toto môžeme nechať na auto. No. Čiže ten flag je continuation na hodnoty nejakých $4840. Dobre. Daniel, ďakujem ti veľmi pekne za 79 kaček, za sliepočku, ktorá neviem, čo tam ukazuje, lebo to mám na... je to veľmi malé. Dodo z Detvy, ďakujem ti veľmi pekne za 5 ebríčok a takisto aj spacecatch.io, čiže krásne promo. 249 kaček, ďakujem ti veľmi, veľmi pekne za supermaníka, toho sme tu už riadne dlho nemali. No, Pavlíkové pohádky, áno, tie Pavlíkové... Dobre, môžeme dať pool a nebudeme dávať pool, že kde Bitcoin môže zakončiť a takéto veci, ale myslím si, že najlepšie by bola táto otázka, som zvedavý na vaše odpovede. No. Takže. Dávam pool. Odtieň, hej, berte to tak chlapsky. Odtieň, čiže červená je ružová, fialová, všetko okolo toho, čo sa môže dotýkať tej červenej farby. Zelená je tyrkysová a všetky tieto farby dookola. hej, modrá je tam nejaká kamienková a všetky tieto veci dookola, hej, čiže berte to také, ten pool, berte tak chlapsky, hej, chlapské videnie farieb, čiže mám taký pocit, že len 8 farieb a nič iné proste nevieme. Čiže, hej, dámy, alebo teda páni, ktorí rozlišujete takéto veci, tak nech sa páči, môžete sa vyšaliť. Dobre, ja idem skôr po tej červenej. Čiže o chvíľočku teda dostaneme dáta a tie dáta budú zobrazené práve v ekonomickom kalendári. Toto nemusíme mať až také príliš veľké, skrz toho, že Paulík nemusí byť až tak na fullke. Dobre, čiže Fed začne až o 20:30. Hej, tí, čo čakáte na Pavela, tak máte ešte nejakú tú necelú, alebo teda pol hodinka aj 3 minútky. Dáta by sme mali vidieť o chvíľočku a následne sa aj rozbehne market. Dneska sme mali Jupiter, mal airdrop, ten celkovo dosť brutálne vyletel, začal sa tradovať aj na Bybite, následne ešte aj DeFi token. DeFi Chain, že vraj teda dostala pokutu, alebo teda má súdny spor s Amerikou. Julian Hosp, to je týpek, ktorý mal predtým platformu 10x. Bola to prvá spoločnosť, ktorá prišla s kreditnou kartou, alebo teda s kartou, kde ste vedeli zamieňať a fungovalo kryptomeny a fungovalo to takisto ako aj Binance, Bybit a všetky karty, ktorý je nie DeFi, ale DFI. Čiže toto zažíva celkovo dosť problémy, aspoň teda, čo som čítal nejaké správy. Ako som hovoril, dneska správy nebudú, nie ich ani príliš veľa, alebo teda nie sú až také najzaujímavejšie, čiže nechám si ich na zajtra, ak teda vôbec bude zajtra livestream, alebo teda nebude. Zajtra určite nebude livestream otvorený, Patreoni. Ak zajtra stihnem jednu vec dokončiť, tak môžete sa tešiť na Eňo Tutti Money Fix, super paráda, jeden brutálny indikátor. Fakt, že podarilo sa mi nájsť ďalšiu úplne nádheru, ja som z toho brutálne nadšený, je to komplikované aj pre mňa, hej, koľko vecí tam viete mať, je to jeden indikátor, ale všetko v jednom, proste to je pre všetkých, ktorí nemáte pro verzie, alebo teda máte nervy z prepínaním, proste jeden masaker. Len ho chcem ešte napojiť, vyskúšať a možno uspraviť tam nejakú stratégiu a tam ešte je jedna dodatočná vec, na ktorej pracujem a má byť masakrálna. Fakt, že zase uľahčenie tradingu a hlavne tým, čo máte, alebo teda chcete skúšať testovať nové veci, tak to bude jedna pecka pre vás. A ja sa z toho brutálne teším, lebo proste môže to nahradiť kompletne všetko. Nie, že čo mám, lebo ja som na to zvyknutý, čo využívam, ale našiel som fakt, že jednu ultimátku. Čiže uvidím zajtra. Nesľubujem vám zajtra na Patrone, ale mali by sme a je to tu. Bitcoin is going to zero. Prakticky dostali sme dáta a nech sa páči, dámy a páni, S&P 500 market, krásna červená sviečka. Prečo je tam červená sviečka? Neviem, lebo prakticky tie dáta sú také isté, ako sa očakávalo, alebo teda sme plne naplnili to, čo sa prakticky očakávalo, čiže úrokové sadzby v Amerike ostávajú na tých istých hodnotách 5,5%, nič iné sa tam nezmenilo. Tým pádom pochybujem, že Ujo Pavel niečo nové povie, prečo S&P 500 market padá. Mám taký pocit, že stres, lebo strašne veľa ľudí zase aj to očakávalo, že proste budú znižované úrokové sadzby. To asi teda príliš veľmi sa nedá očakávať. Možno tam napísali nejakú negatívnejšiu správu. Jedinú negatívnejšiu správu, ktorú si viem predstaviť, že by tam napísali, je práve to, že proste povedali, alebo teda možno, hej, to tam niekde je, že nerozmýšľajú tak dramaticky spúšťať úrokové sadzby, ale podľa mňa tam budú tie isté žvásty, ja už vidím prvý žvás, čiže chceme dostať nezamestnanosť a infláciu na zhruba tie 2% z dlhodobého pohľadu, čiže hej, zatiaľ teda to je na vyšších číslach než teda 2%. Čo sa týka the community judge, risk assessment are moving into the better balance. Čiže toto je celkovo pozitívna committee, alebo teda zástupcovia tej FOMCčka celkovo pozerajú na to, že tie inflačné góly, alebo teda tie inflačné plány idú celkovo dobre, alebo teda v poriadku. Economický outlook is uncertain, čiže stále ekonomický pohľad je stále nie úplne najpriaznivejší. Stále sú tam problémy okolo toho, že to môže celkovo pušnúť smerom hore, in support of the goals committee, bla bla bla, čiže tu len povedali, že ostávajú na tých 5,5 bazických bodov, 525 bazických bodov až 550 bazických bodov, čiže stále sa berie to maximálne číslo, reduce target range of inflation, forwards 2%, OK, objective 2%, čiže stále nič, točenica okolo toho istého, čiže tu príliš veľké zmeny teda nenastali. Dobre. Žvásty, conduct, toto je úplne to isté, 160 miliard, alebo teda biliónov dolárov za deň budú vyťahovať. No, dámy a páni, čiže žiadna zmena. A dokonca tu ani nič príliš veľmi nové nepovedali, alebo teda ani nič tam príliš veľmi nezaznelo. Statement of long run goals. No, PDF-ko nejaké nové, čiže máme tu do frasa. To už, aha, to je iba jedna strana, OK. Čiže long run, aký je ich cieľ z dlhodobého pohľadu? No, maximálna zamestnanosť, až na to, že oni to príliš veľmi nechcú. Čiže tu je ten maximal level on FOMC base and include goals. Dobre, čiže nič zaujímavé. Nič. Dobre, čiže no, dobre, čiže dozvedeli sme sa veľký kulový, alebo teda nové veci sme sa určite nedozvedeli, keďže nie je tu totálne, ale že totálne nič, dokonca ešte aj ten report, oni to originálne robia copy-paste, hej, on normálne príde na predchádzajúci meeting, spraví copy, prilepí to a len tu zmenia dáta. Aj to teraz nemuseli vôbec nič meniť, okrem toho dátumu, lebo sa tu nezmenilo totálne nič. Bitcoin is going to the moon. Veľmi silná sviečka, totálne odmietanie, síce zastavená na hodnote 21 a 30, čiže dampola party, pokiaľ nie sme nad hodnotou 21 a 30, respektíve nad hodnotou 43 500 alebo teda $600, tak si treba dávať ešte bacha, ale no change, hej, čiže tu na žiadne prekvapenia teda neprišli, neočakávame nič, že ani Powell spraví. Podľa mňa, čo on bude robiť teraz na tom meetingu je, že príde on, hej, prvá polhodina bude, alebo teda 15 minút bude mega nudných, keď tu nemá príliš veľmi čo čítať, bude mega nudných a to hlavne v tom, že on to si to krásne prečíta a následne bude dostávať otázky, ktoré má predpripravené, hej, aby sme boli všetci, aby sme v tom mali jasno, čiže keď mu dá niekto nejakú horúcu otázku, tak nie je to horúca otázka, lebo už má na ňu odpoveď. A ak zabudne tú debilnú odpoveď, tak on si to ešte aj prečíta v tých svojich nódoch, ktoré tam má. Čiže je to veľký stream a môžeme to rozpustiť. Áno. No, áno, hej, tak by som to mohol pohodička aj teraz ukončovať. Bude tu teraz, hej, nejaká mini price akcia, následne sa to zabrzdí predtým, než príde Powell. Ako náhle ho uvidí market, okamžite začne mini volatilitka, potom keď to začne čítať, tak tam nebude vôbec žiadna volatilita a následne, keď začne dostávať otázky, tak tam to začne celkovo skákať a nakoniec ukončíme deň na tých istých hodnotách. Hej, zatiaľ teda Bitcoin nevidím, že by malo odpaľovať na tú hodnotu $44 000. Skôr to teda vyzerá, že si pôjdeme otestovať fakt, že tie nižšie hodnoty 43 200 až to 42 600. Zase pochybujem, že by sme mali vypadnúť z toho trendu. Ten flak tam máme celkovo dosť jasný. $42 500 je tá úroveň na weekly time frame a na vrchná hodnota rezistencie je $44 000, ako som ukazoval. Čiže aj keď dneska by sme mohli trošička prepadnúť alebo preletieť na tú úroveň, je to úplne jedno, lebo aj tak sa musíme pozerať na to, aby tá weekly sviečka vôbec zatvorila. Čiže Ona môže byť dneska úplne celé zle a nakoniec... No dobře, máte ešte 23 minút. 23 minút na to, aby ste hlasovali. Zatiaľ teda priebeh hlasovania je zhruba takýto. Čiže červený odtieň 31%, modrý odtieň 40%, zelený odtieň 14% a čierna kravata 16%. Čiže zatiaľ pool jednoznačne dominuje modrý odtieň kravaty. Posledné meetingy mám taký pocit, že stále odtiene červenej, čiže uvidíme, či jej ostane verný alebo nie. Že seklo to trošku, tak sa nečudujem ani pri takom... Až YouTube sa zasekol, aký Bitcoin spravil pohyb. Pavel príde bez kravaty s motýlikom. Alebo keby prišlo bez kravaty a úplne ožratý, to by bola aspoň stranda. Ale ak ste dlho, alebo ak máte problém so spaním, tak určite dajte si sluchátka, choďte si ľahnúť, zatvorte oči a o 8:30, od nejakej 8:40 budete spať ako zarezaný, lebo proste Pavol má v tom hlase takú tú silu, že proste fakt, že by sa mohol púšťať deťom. Originál by sa mohol púšťať deťom predtým, ak idú spať. Večerníček ich tak neuspí, ako ten týpek vie uspať kompletne všetkých. Mňa seká, ale v krížoch. Mňa už našťastie... Ani to nejdem hovoriť. Ani to radšej nejdem hovoriť. Dobre, čiže zatiaľ teda shortové pozície dominujú tí, čo máte short pozície. Ak máte možnosť posunúť stopku do plusu, nepozerajte sa na to, že môžeme padnúť ešte neviem ako nízko, dajte si tú stopku do plusu. Lebo vidíte, že čo robí market. Zatiaľ teda nejaká enormná dumpola party nenastáva, možno trošku na S&P 500 markete, ale zatiaľ teda Bitcoin dosť taký, aký celý. A odkedy boli schválené bitcoinové spotové ETF, tak zhruba máme takúto story na Bitcoine, kedy príde 3 palice rýchlo a potom celkovo nuda. Čo bude výhra? Neviem. Asi nič. Neviem, môžeme niečo niekedy vymysleť. Palko je na auto suggestions pred spaním, áno. Ináč, veľká sranda by bola, keby prišiel s tými Apple Glass, či jak sa to volá, Apple Augmented Reality, či jak to ich nazvali. A je to celkovo sranda, ale myslím si, že od nejakej AI sme ešte, alebo teda od nejakej Artificial Intelligence, alebo teda Reality, sme ešte... Augmented reality, pardon, sme ešte asi dosť ďaleko. Niečo sa tu zmenilo. Vidíme tu orla, vidíme tu ľudí, ktorí sú úplne, že zatiaľ teda nezaspatí, lebo ešte Oni majú takéto loga, či čo to tam majú? To je education, aha. No, tak by ich veľa naučil. Okamžite, keď prišlo promo na Federal Education, tak okamžite zažívame dump. Čiže tieto videá musíme púšťať Bitcoinu každý deň. Ahoj, čo s tým Jupiterom bude mať nejakú utility? No, tak taká klasika, hej, využívanie na fíčka, pool, alebo teda staking DeFi a borrowing a lending. Mám taký pocit, že tam bude plus trade, hej, čiže dá sa tradovať aj na ich platforme. Predpokladám, že tam dajú, že keď vlastníte určitý počet tokenov, tak proste budete mať vlastnejšie fíčka a plus ešte nejaké využitie určite tomu nájdu, ale nič také nejaké svetoborné tam určite netreba hľadať. Áno, tie... tie... Mne skôr pripadajú ako snowboardové okuliare. Ale akože 4 za to dať je psycho. Je originál psycho. To už len, kúpil by som si to skrz toho, že je to prvý model. Hej, že mať niekedy do budúcna, keď pojem do dôchodku, tak možno prvý model takéhoto zariadenia predáte za veľa, keďže aj tie zabalené jednoznačné, keďže aj staré iPhony, že vraj sa tie prvé verzie sa predávajú za špinavé peniaze, brutálne veľké. To mi zapne muziku, kým to začne. Nemôžem zapnúť, lebo okamžite YouTube zakročí. Keďže má dosť veľké problémy. Short. Dominancia. Dobre, čiže toto môžeme vypnúť. Zatiaľ sa teda trafili. Zajtra si potrebujeme ďalšie dáta. Dáta, ekonomický kalendár. Teoreticky môžeme takisto vypnúť. Dobre, toto ešte necháme. Čiže, tak toto vyzerá dosť na prd. Dobre, čiže... No, ja. Je to tu. Dobre, long and shorts. Long and shorts ratio. Zatiaľ teda je to vyrovnané. Longy 51,70%, to je za posledné... síce za posledné 4 hodiny, to je úplne jedno. Áno, je to 50-50, originál 50-50. Hej, normálne ratio 1,0392. Čiže žiadne obrovské zmeny. Market je skôr teda neutrálne naladený. Nič katastrofálne sa tam teda nerobí. Heatmap za posledný deň, tu nás sa to celkovo posunulo, $43 600, $680. Ale to lízalo týchto ľudí, ale stihli si to nejako doplniť, čiže tá 44 tisícka, dokonca 44 200 už by to mohlo celkovo rozpohybovať. $44 250 je veľký prúser pre shorterov a nás, ale longery ináč sú tí môj kokos, jak sú naložení. U longerov nebudú ani tak príliš veľmi problémy, 43 100, ale kde to začne celkovo, už naberá celkovo na veľmi pekných obrátkach, 42 800 zhruba, 42 800, 42 780, to je ten target pre tú druhú skupinku. A nech sa páči, Bitcoin is going to zero. Konečne, poďme, 30 000, nech je tam, nech sú tie shortové pozície v zelených číslach. Áno, určite využijte môj link, ktorý dal veľký táto, zdravím ťa a ďakujem veľmi pekne. Čiže určite ho využijte. Je to ref link, čiže budete tam mať nejakú zľavu. A co tí, ktorí longujú? Not good. Hlavne teda, keď ste v nejakých kruto šialených pozíciách. Možno keď toto videjko vypne na FOMC, tak 42 700 long limit. Môžeš to skúsiť, len si určite tam aj hoď nejakú tú stopečku. A teraz by som veľmi na limit, akože teraz by som išiel s malou pákou, aj na Bitcoine. Hej, určite aj na Bitcoine s menšou pákou. Lebo zase chcete byť v pozícii, nechcete byť nutne vyhodený kvôli nejakému dementnému weeku na 42 600 alebo 42 500. Ale máme tam ešte jeden celkovo dosť dobrý level a to je 43 200. No áno, sme riadne, ale že riadne ďaleko od 30 000, hlavne teda je tam toľko soprotových línií, že až to nie je sranda. Dobre, prišiel som na taký systém, že ako môžem mať trošička dlhšie videjka a mal by som si kúpiť aj originál baterky, lebo som si objednal nejaké baterky s nejakou čínskou somarinou s nabíjačkou na 4 baterky a prišli mi 4 čínske baterky. Vydržia ani nie hodinu, ale zase budem ich len tak vymieňať a potom dokúpim originál Sony baterky. Je to 100-ročná kamera, ale hlavné je, že tie baterky stoja už viac ako tá kamera celkovo. Už kríže sú v pohode, ale áno, cvičím všetko, cvičím so svojou váhou. Akože teraz mám problém s treslami, lebo hej, mňa keď dačo chytí, tak musím ísť ako psychopat, čiže je tam problém teraz v treslách. Nech sa páči. Dobre, nechám vás chvíľočku, keďže odskočím si len po jednu vec. Takže, nech sa páči, $43 150 bola hitnutá len taký fukot, čiže toto celkovo to preletelo. Bitcoin is going to zero, konečne, už sme na to dlho čakali, nech sa to celkovo rozhýbe. Ako som hovoril, treba si všímať tú weekly, tam asi teda príliš veľký, hej, prakticky, rozprával som to v nedeľu, aj minulý týždeň, aj predchádzajúci, alebo teda týždeň, čiže 2 týždne dozadu. Pohybujeme sa, máme zatiaľ teda vytvorený kanál, v ktorom sa pohybujeme medzi určitými hodnotami a zatiaľ to nič ale nie je. Ináč dobre sa to celkovo traduje, lebo ako náhle na tie 45 minútovke nalomíme a naštrbíme tú 21 a takisto aj 200, tak potom je to veľmi, ale že veľmi jednoduchá story, čo sa týka tradingu. Hej, čiže je to zatiaľ teda veľmi dobré obdobie. Ja už som v štortíku od tej 43 700, nastúpil som len skrz toho, že na weekly sme sa dotkli tej úrovne a som si myslel, že zažijeme väčšiu price akciu a jasnejšiu story na Bitcoiníku ešte pred dátami, hej, ale tak trošku sme tam zamrzli, hej, ale zase dostali sme sa tam celkovo ešte predtým, než boli dáta. Myslel som si, že zažijeme trošičku dumpulu party a následne možno nejakú odpalovku na tie pozitívne dáta, ktoré prišli, ale aj tak to vyhovuje, hej. Či už som to trafil jedným spôsobom, alebo stále je tam otvorená pozícia. Stopky do plusu, to je jasné a nemám tu čo veľmi riešiť. Dneska, aj napriek tomu, že počas livestreamu už úspešný jeden trade a už bude aj zabezpečený. Teraz som si to čekol, vyzerá to celkovo dobre. Nie je čo riešiť, čiže už nech Pavel povie čokoľvek. Nastavil som si to tak, alebo tým, že nemám príliš veľa času a nebudem to príliš veľmi teda tu na kontrolovať skrz toho, že predal som tablet a musím byť teda pozerať Paulíka na telefóne, tak nebudem na burze, tak som si nastavil trailing stop loss a keď proste to hitne nejaké psychohodnoty, čo sa Bitcoinu týka a následne altcoiny, tak proste to hitne. Keď nehytne, tak mám už zabezpečené veľmi pekné percentá za tých 20 minút, čo je trade otvorený. Ja mám nákupky na 37 000 cca a stále nič. 37 000 a stále nič, no hej, tak no, ja sa pozerám na 32 a to ešte je oveľa ďalej, jak o tvojej 37 000. Cvičíš podľa niekoho, Tome, alebo máš svoj vlastný plán? Vieš čo, mám také apky celkovo dobré aj cez hodinky, čiže nejaké suggestion tréningy a cez Nightgun. Čiže je to tam také, hej, že ja potrebujem len mať nejaký program, ktorý je fakt, že taký, že viem, že každý, lebo keď to mám len tak, že to nemám napísané a idem do posilky, alebo mám to napísané, ale nič ma to netlačí, tak proste niekedy tam pôjdem, niekedy tam nepôjdem, ale tým, že mám aplikácie a vidím tam, hej, tú fajku, že vtedy by si mal cvičiť, alebo hodinky mi dajú vedieť, dneska by si mal zacvičiť. A viem, že keď si zacvičím, dá mi tam tú fajku, hej, že mám tam nejaký ten progres. Čiže toto ma celkovo baví, hej, že ma to núti, že ty vole, nemám tam fajku, ser ma to, že tam nemám v kalendári fajku, tak idem cvičiť. Čiže u mňa napríklad ukáž paže necvičím, lebo chcem si dať dokopy telo, chrbát. Hej, čiže mňa ruky, hrudník ma vôbec teraz nezaujímajú. U mňa je práve to, že ukáž buchty. Buchty mám veľké. U mňa je to, že chcem práve schudnúť a spevniť telo. Hej. Už nepotrebujem na seba nahadzovať váhu. Budú ma klby boliť aj bez toho, aby som mal nasekané nejaké šialené bicepsáky. Hej. To, keď som bol zastraný, bol som nabitý a teraz už nepotrebujem. Veľa energie to stojí na to, aby ste udržovali také telo. Čiže radšej schudnúť teraz na staré kolena a užívať si beh, hlavne aktivitu, pohyb. Najlepšie je freestyle trading. Áno. A tak ja zase mám tréningový plán tak vytvorený. N-link kupoval niekto? N-link. Nie. Ja som nekupoval, ale práve včera som na neho pozeral, že či to teda dať alebo nedať, on vyletel a je to taká somarina. Chcel som ho nakúpiť na nejaký ten zvyšok na E3, lenže včera boli poplatky zhruba nejakých $15 cez Ether chain a mal som len na jednej konkrétnej peňaženke som mal len, bola to dobrá správa, mal som $32 a nejako mi to chcelo nakúpiť len za $10 a $15 poplatok, tak som si povedal, že to nedáva celkom logiku, čiže som si tie peniaze presunul na Blast. Čiže a uvidíme, že či z toho Blastu teda vôbec niečo bude. Ale vyzerá to tak, že začína nám airdrop sezóna a oplatí sa byť teda vo viacerých projektoch, čo sa týka hocakého chainu, hej, čiže DeFi. Marek, dúfam, že áno. Marek sa pýta, má šancu ešte i One vrátiť sa na hodnoty z posledného bullrunu? Dúfam, že áno, lebo ja mám takisto One. A zatiaľ tam nie je príliš veľmi čo riešiť, hej. Proste akurát jediná taká negatívna správa je, aj to len z krátkodobého hľadiska, aspoň ja sa teda tak na to pozerám, že zatiaľ teda ešte neodpálil. Čiže to je zase príležitosť na to, aby sme nakumulovali, lebo veľa ľudí aj to práve riešilo, keď Bitcoin bol na hodnote $16,000, alebo teda $20,000, že nič to nerobí, prakticky stagnujú a veľa ľudí nenakúpilo či už Solanu, Chainlink, aj keď sme robili analýzky, hovorili sme, že kde je tá červená zóna a kde sú asi nákupky a veľa ľudí to proste nenakúpilo, lebo očakávali, že to padne ešte nižšie a nižšie a nižšie a nižšie, čiže teraz je to nudné teritorium, alebo teda teraz je to nudné na viacerých altcoinoch a to hlavne skrz toho, že proste Bitcoin ani nedampuje, ani nepampuje, hej. Čiže ono na 5 minútov, keď tu vidíme nenormálny pohyb, lenže ten pohyb nie je vôbec veľký, lebo je to nejaké 5 kilka, hej. Čiže ten pohyb je dosť trapoš voči tomu, že ako to bolo niekedy. Hej, čiže my tam potrebujeme fakt, že nejaký brutálny pohyb na weekly timeframe, na veľké supportovky, na veľkú alebo prejazdenie veľkej hodnoty rezistencie na to, aby sme videli aj altcoiny sa rozhýbať. Lebo altcoiny takisto sa im bars veľmi nechce nič robiť. Ale ako náhle sa to začne dostávať do pozitíva, tak verím, že to potiahne aj práve One. Suj by som nechával. A price targety ja nedávam, ale Suj má našlapnuté fakt, že veľmi dobre. Minimálne skrz toho, že začína sa tam veľa projektov budovať. Aktivita na chaine je veľká, ja som to aj sledoval. Zatiaľ som ešte teda nemal čas príliš veľmi vojsť do toho ekosystému. A to je hlavne skrz toho, že proste mám toho na rukách a na ramenách strašne veľa. Hej. Čiže nestíham využívať DeFi a testovať tú platformu Suj. Hej, čiže to sa musím priznať, že ešte nejaké, čo tam dali, comment it. Ešte som nestihol to poriadne čeknúť, ale zatiaľ teda, čo som čítal minimálne veci, ľudia sú extrémne spokojní. Zase, hej, musím si to vyskúšať. Ako náhle si to vyskúšam a bude tam všetko tak ako, lebo napríklad na Solane som ostal len vďaka tomu, že veľa ľudí ma odrádzalo zo Solany a hlavne teda Maxici niekedy, že proste je to totálne centralizované bla bla bla, ale keď ste boli v Ether chaine a robili ste tam nejaké transakcie a keď som sa pozrel na to, že keď má niekto tu na $50-100 zainvestovaných a chce byť v DeFi, chce sa zúčastniť nejakých airdropov, chce nejako možno netradovať, ale chce proste mať pasívny príjem nejaký, tak to bolo možnosť práve cez DeFi, ale na Ether sieti akože s 50 ste tam mohli akorát tak zaplatiť poplatky a ísť dovidenia, hej. Čiže práve preto, a ešte keď som začal skúšať Solanu, Solana fičala jak jedna až, a potom prišiel bear market, potom tam prišli zrútenia, čo nebolo dobré, na to som aj apeloval, že proste ak chcú byť konkurenčná sieť a ak chcú dokázať v budúcnosti veľa, tak proste musia si vyriešiť tie problémy, ktoré mali s tými pádmi siete. Zase, hej, nejako katastrofálne som to nebral, lebo nový projekt, prišlo tam extrémne veľa ľudí, začali sa robiť extrémne veľa transakcií, možno ani developeri nečakali, že bude taký obrovský tlak. Čiže prešli si sa zaťažkávajúcou skúškou, zistili, že je to celé v prdeli a musia proste zabrať na budovaní a zatiaľ teda odvtedy, čo im padla sieť od minulého roka v decembri, tak odvtedy boli, alebo sú zatiaľ teda úplne v pohodička, dúfame, že to tak aj ostane. Čiže ono je to, hej, všetkému musíme dať čas. VRA valí patenty, síce trošku negatívne správy okolo nich, ale DCA dokupujete. Ja osobne nie, ale keď tam majú dobré správy a keď to všetko tam funguje, tak síce si povedal, že správy nemajú dobré, ale to zase veľa, treba fakt, že si odskúšať tie veci a pozrieť sa, že či sú fakt tak. No, na staré kolena. To je na staré kolena, fakt, že. Alebo teda dobre, moje telo mi dalo najavo, že keď som bol 18-ročný, 19-ročný, tak som hral hádzanú, hral som futbal a proste robil som čiastočne len také mini polo for fun, hej, hokej každú zimu, keď proste zamrzla voda, alebo proste niekedy boli normálne mrazy. Plával som, potápal som sa na Cypre, proste furt aktivita, hej, žil som, nikdy v živote som ani necvičil, už keď som, mám taký pocit, že od 18 som vôbec necvičil a som mal lepšie telo, keď som cvičil. Lebo proste aktívne som fungoval a teraz som len začal behať. A telo mi ukázalo, že bratu, akože nebudeš dávať také časy, jak si dával niekedy a môže na to zabudnúť, lebo proste ti rozkopem kompletne klby, nohy, všetko. Ten Bybit je bez KYC? Už nie. Max je bez KYC zatiaľ. Enlink som kúpil na Maxe a už som... A to ma nenapadlo na Maxe kúpiť. Ale akože super, že ma to nenapadlo. Lebo no. Ide dám pola party. No, nech sa páči, dámy a páni, prichádza na scénu Jerome Powell. Všetci sa môžeme tešiť na tú kravatu. Zatiaľ teda 36% ľudí si myslí, že kravata bude modrého odtieňa. 34% ľudí si myslí, že červeného odtieňa a následne čierna 18% a zelený odtieň je 13%, čiže uvidíme, ktorá farbička to bude a nechajme sa teda prekvapiť, aká farba to bude. Bitcoin is going to zero. A nech sa páči, moja predikcia vyšla, čiže je to na červenú farbu, alebo teda červený odtieň. Tú istú kravatu, čo mal predtým. Dobre, už ho nechám. Dúfam, že zvuk funguje a nefunguje.
Progress toward our dual mandate objectives. Inflation has eased from its highs without a significant increase in unemployment. That's very good news. But inflation is still too high, ongoing progress in bringing it down is not assured, and the path forward is uncertain. I want to assure the American people that we are fully committed to returning inflation to our 2% goal. Restoring price stability is essential to achieve a sustained period of strong labor market conditions that benefit all. Today, the FOMC decided to leave our policy interest rate unchanged and to continue to reduce our securities holdings. Over the past 2 years, we have significantly tightened the stance of monetary policy. Our strong actions have moved our policy rate well into restrictive territory, and we've been seeing the effects on economic activity and inflation. As labor market tightness has eased and progress on inflation has continued, the risks to achieving our employment and inflation goals are moving into better balance. I will have more to say about monetary policy after briefly reviewing economic developments. Recent indicators suggest that economic activity has been expanding at a solid pace. GDP growth in the fourth quarter of last year came in at 3.3%. For 2023 as a whole, GDP expanded at 3.1%, bolstered by strong consumer demand as well as improving supply conditions. Activity in the housing sector was subdued over the past year, largely reflecting high mortgage rates. High interest rates also appear to have been weighing on business fixed investment. The labor market remains tight, but supply and demand conditions continue to come into better balance. Over the past 3 months, payroll job gains have averaged 165,000 jobs per month, a pace that is well below that seen a year ago, but still strong. The unemployment rate remains low at 3.7%. Strong job creation has been accompanied by an increase in the supply of workers. The labor force participation rate has moved up on balance over the past year, particularly for individuals aged 25 to 54 years, and immigration has returned to pre-pandemic levels. Nominal wage growth has been easing and job vacancies have declined. Although the jobs to workers gap has narrowed, labor demand still exceeds the supply of available workers. Inflation has eased notably over the past year, but remains above our longer run goal of 2%. Total PCE prices rose 2.6% over the 12 months ending in December. Excluding the volatile food and energy categories, core PCE prices rose 2.9%. The lower inflation readings over the second half of last year are welcome, but we will need to see continuing evidence to build confidence that inflation is moving down sustainably toward our goal. Longer-term inflation expectations appear to remain well anchored, as reflected in a broad range of surveys of households, businesses, and forecasters, as well as measures from financial markets. The Fed's monetary policy actions are guided by our mandate to promote maximum employment and stable prices for the American people. My colleagues and I are acutely aware that high inflation imposes significant hardship as it erodes purchasing power, especially for those least able to meet the higher costs of essentials like food, housing, and transportation. We're highly attentive to the risks that high inflation poses to both sides of our mandate, and we're strongly committed to returning inflation to our 2% objective. Over the past 2 years, we have raised our policy rate by 5.25 percentage points, and we've decreased our securities holdings by more than $1.3 trillion. Our restrictive stance of monetary policy is putting downward pressure on economic activity and inflation. The committee decided at today's meeting to maintain the target range for the federal funds rate at 5.25 to 5.5%, and to continue the process of significantly reducing our securities holdings. We believe that our policy rate is likely at its peak for this tightening cycle, and that, if the economy evolves broadly as expected, it will likely be appropriate to begin dialing back policy restraint at some point this year. But the economy has surprised forecasters in many ways since the pandemic, and ongoing progress toward our 2% inflation objective is not assured. The economic outlook is uncertain, and we remain highly attentive to inflation risks. We are prepared to maintain the current target range for the federal funds rate for longer, if appropriate. As labor market tightness has eased and progress on inflation has continued, the risks to achieving our employment and inflation goals are moving into better balance. We know that reducing policy restraint too soon or too much could result in a reversal of the progress we've seen on inflation and ultimately require even tighter policy to get inflation back to 2%. At the same time, reducing policy restraint too late or too little could unduly weaken economic activity and employment. In considering any adjustments to the target range for the federal funds rate, the committee will carefully assess the incoming data, the evolving outlook, and the balance of risks. The committee does not expect that it will be appropriate to reduce the target range until it has gained greater confidence that inflation is moving sustainably toward 2%. We will continue to make our decisions meeting by meeting. We remain committed to bringing inflation back down to our 2% goal and to keeping longer-term inflation expectations well anchored. Restoring price stability is essential to set the stage for achieving maximum employment and stable prices over the longer run. To conclude, we understand that our actions affect communities, families, and businesses across the country. Everything we do is in service to our public mission. We at the Fed will do everything we can to achieve our maximum
Bitcoin is
employment
going
and
to
price
zero okamžite,
stability
keď
goals.
dostane
Thank
otázku,
you.
tak
I look
ideme
forward to
na
your
nulu.
questions.
Ja to vidím trošička skôr ako vy. Zavrel laptop.
Gina Smiley from the New York Times. Thanks for taking our questions. Obviously, in the statement and just in your remarks there, you note that you don't want to cut interest rates without greater confidence that inflation is coming down fully. I wonder, what do you need to see at this point to gain that confidence? And as you make those decisions, how are you weighing recent strong growth in consumer spending data against the sort of solid inflation progress you've been seeing?
Sorry, say the last part again.
How are you weighing the growth data and consumption data, which have been surprisingly strong, against inflation data?
Okay, so what are we looking for to get greater confidence? Let me say that we have confidence. We're looking for greater confidence that inflation is moving sustainably down to 2%. Implicitly, we do have confidence and has been increasing, but we want to get greater confidence. What do we want to see? We want to see more good data. It's not that we're looking for better data. We're looking at continuation of the good data that we've been seeing. And a good example is inflation. So we have 6 months of good inflation data. The question really is, that 6 months of good inflation data, is it sending us a true signal that we are in fact on a path, a sustainable path down to 2% inflation? That's the question. And the answer will come from some more data that's also good data. It's not that the 6-month data isn't low enough. It is. It's just a question of, can we take that with confidence that we're moving sustainably down to 2%? That's really what we're thinking about. In terms of growth, we've had strong growth. I mean, if you take a step back, we've had strong growth, very strong growth last year, going right into the fourth quarter. And yet we've had a very strong labor market, and we've had inflation coming down. So I think, whereas a year ago we were thinking that we needed to see some softening in economic activity, that hasn't been the case. So I think we look at stronger growth. We don't look at it as a problem. I think at this point we want to see strong growth. We want to see a strong labor market. We're not looking for a weaker labor market. We're looking for inflation to continue to come down as it has been coming down for the last 6 months.
And I'm sorry, if I could just follow up very quickly. When you say that you want to make sure that it's a true signal, is there anything that you're seeing in the data that makes you doubt that it's a true signal at this stage?
No, I think I would say it seems to be the likely case that we will achieve that confidence, but we have to achieve it, and we haven't yet. And so, I mean, it's a good story. We have 6 months of good inflation, but you can, and you know this, you can look behind those numbers and you can see that a lot of it's been coming from goods inflation, for example. And goods inflation running significantly negative. It's a reasonable assumption that over time, goods inflation will flatten out, probably approximate zero. That would mean the services sectors would have to contribute more. So, in other words, what we care about is the aggregate number, not so much the composition. But we just need to see more. That's where we are as a committee. We need to see more evidence that sort of confirms what we think we're seeing, and that tells us that we are gives us confidence that we're on a path to a sustainable path down to 2% inflation.
Nick Timros of the Wall Street Journal. Chair Powell, it seems to me you raised rates rapidly over the last 2 years for 2 reasons. One was the risk of a wage price spiral. 2, there were risks of inflation expectations becoming unanchored. This morning's ECI report for the fourth quarter shows private sector payroll growth running at a sub 4% pace. Inflation expectations are very close to where they were before the inflation emergency of the last 3 years. And given that you appear to have substantially cut off these 2 tail risks, and that you've judged here today current policy as well in the
ukážu, že je
restrictive
to taký
territory.
štandard, vieš,
What
čiže
good
tam
reason is there to keep policy rates above 5%?
sa
Are you
asi
really
nikdy
going to learn
nezmení.
more waiting 6 weeks versus 3 months
SAP
from
to the
now
moon?
that you have
No,
avoided those
hej,
two
tak
risks?
už ho drží iba tá rezistencia. Sice je to 5 minútovka, čiže o nič. Ale vyzerá to dobre.
As you know,
Zle pre tých,
almost
čo tu
every
bolo.
participant on the committee does believe that it will be appropriate to reduce rates. And
S&P.
for partly for the reasons that you say, you know, we feel like inflation is coming down.
S&P 500.
Growth has been
S&P
strong. The
500.
labor market is strong. What we're trying to do is identify a place where we're really confident about inflation getting back down 2%, so that we can then begin the process of dialing back the restrictive level. So overall, I think people do believe, and as you know, the median participant wrote down 3 rate cuts this year. But I think to get to that place where we feel comfortable starting the process, we need some confirmation that inflation is in fact coming down sustainably to 2%.
If I could ask differently, if you hold rates high as inflation moderates, as it has been, target rates will exceed the prescriptions of the Taylor rule or experience. What would be the reasoning for holding rates higher than the levels recommended by those rules in the current instance?
Well, look, I think, as you know, we consult a range of Taylor rules and non-Taylor kind of rules. We consult them regularly. They're in our teal book, and they're in all the materials that we look at. But, you know, I don't think we've ever been at a place where we were setting policy by them. And they're, depending on the rule, it will tell you different things. There are many different formulations. Another way to think about it is, implicitly, is so. In theory, of course, real rates go up if holding all else equal as inflation comes down. But that doesn't mean we can mechanically adjust policy as real rates, as inflation comes down. It doesn't mean that at all, because for one thing, we don't know. We look at more than just the Fed funds rate. We look at broadly financial conditions. But in addition, we don't know with great confidence where the neutral rate of interest is at any given time. But that also doesn't mean that we wait around for to see the economy turn down, because that would be too late. So we're really in a risk management mode of managing the risk, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, managing the risk that we move too soon and move too late. And I think to move, which is where almost everyone on the committee is in favor of moving rates down this year. But the timing of that is going to be linked to our gaining confidence that inflation is on a sustainable path down to 2%.
Howard.
Hi, thanks, Chair Powell. I'd like you to key in on the use of the word in the statement that inflation still remains elevated. You've pledged to cut rates before inflation reached 2%. So that implies that there's some sort of intermediate step here on inflation, and that a cut would be consequent with a change in the statement language that inflation remains elevated. What's the step down from there?
Yeah, I don't know that we've worked out the particular statement language and that kind of thing. I would just say, if you look at where 12-month inflation is, and it's still well above. Core is 2.9%, for example, 12 months, which is way down from where it was. Very, very positive development, very fast decline, and the case is likely that it will continue to come down. So that's where it is. But we're wanting to see more data.
So if I could follow up on that, the statement allows that you want greater confidence on inflation falling before you cut, but it doesn't mention the other side of the mandate, a slide in employment. Would a slide in employment also bring you to the point of cutting rates?
Yes. So let me say that we're not looking for that. It's not something we're looking for. But yes, if you think about, in the base case, the economy is performing well, the labor market remains strong. If we saw an unexpected weakening certainly in the labor market, that would certainly weigh on cutting sooner. Absolutely. And if we saw inflation being stickier or higher or those sorts of things, would argue for moving later. In the base case, though, where the economy is healthy and we have ongoing growth, solid growth, we have a strong labor market, we have inflation coming down. That's what people are writing their SEP around. And in that case, what we're saying is, based on that, we think we can and should take advantage of that and be careful as we approach that question of when to begin to dial back restriction.
Claire Jones, Financial Times. Just to circle back to the greater confidence aspect of the statement, there's been a lot of unanimity in recent meetings. I'm just wondering, going forward, when it comes to all needing greater confidence, is the unanimity, or at least consensus among FOMC members, about what the threshold for that greater confidence is? And if not, could you maybe tell us a little bit about the discussion today on, what the variations between FOMC members was on what constitutes enough confidence to cut rates, and also if there was any variation on how quickly that greater confidence threshold could be reached. Thank you.
We're not really at that stage. There was no proposal to cut rates. Some people did talk about their view of the rate path. I would point you to the SEP as good evidence of where people are, although it is one cycle later. So, we're not at a place of really working out those kinds of details because we weren't actively considering moving the federal funds rate down. I will say there is a wide disparity, a healthy disparity of views, and you see that in public statements, in the minutes and the transcripts when they're released every 5 years. So we do have a healthy set of differences, and I think that's actually essential for making good policy. We're also able to reach agreement generally because we listen to each other, we compromise, and even though not everybody loves what we do, they're able to, for the most part, able to join in. To me, that's a well-functioning public institution.
Rachel.
Hi, Chair Powell, Rachel Siegel from the Washington Post. Thanks for taking our questions. So over the past few years, there have been all these real-time indicators that helped us gain a sharper understanding of where the economy was, like open table data or office attendance. You've talked about vacancies in the past. And I'm wondering at the start of this year, what might be on that dashboard for you that's giving you the clearest picture of the economy, including on rents, if you could touch on that. Including? Rent costs.
Yeah. Well, so we're not, it's not the pandemic, so we can actually rely on more traditional forms. People are working, they're getting wages, and the economy is largely reopened and is broadly normalizing, as you see. So I wouldn't say we're looking at that sort of more innovative data as much. You point to rents, so of course we follow the components of inflation very carefully, which would be goods inflation. I talked about that a little bit. You mentioned housing inflation, so the question is, when will these lower market rents find their way into measured rents as measured in PCE inflation? And we think that's coming, and we know it's coming. It's just a question of when and how big it'll be. So, but that's in everyone's forecast, I would say. So that will help. But at the same time, we think goods inflation will probably, it's been giving a lot of disinflation to the effort, and probably that declines over time. But it may well have some more time to run. The supply chains are not perfectly back to where they were. In addition, it takes time for the healing process to get into prices. So there may be still a tailwind. We'll find out with that. So we look at the things that relate to our mandate very carefully, and as you would imagine.
I guess just as a quick follow-up, do you feel comfortable at this point saying the economy has reached a soft landing, or is that part of looking for more confidence? No, I wouldn't say we've achieved that, and I think we have a ways to go. Inflation is still, core inflation is still well above target on a 12-month basis. 12 months is our target. Certainly, I'm encouraged, and we're encouraged by the progress, but we're not declaring victory at all at this point. We think we have a ways to go.
Steve.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You've said that you would know the neutral rate by its works. So I'm wondering what you could tell me. How do you believe the neutral rate is working? We're telling you right now that growth is stronger. In other words, how much is the economy really being restrained right now by the current funds rate? And how much restraint does it really need additionally if inflation is still coming down?
So I think you do see in the interest-sensitive parts of the economy, you do see, for example, housing, you see the effects, you do. Your second question, though, really, I think is important, and that is a lot of this has come through a lot of the disinflationary process has come through the healing of supply chains and also of the labor market. So you've seen that, that other set of factors is really different from other cycles and has brought that, working with tighter policy, which has enabled the supply side to recover, I think that mixture has been behind what has enabled this. So no, we really do think that we're having an effect broadly across the economy. I would point to the interest sensitive parts of the economy as well as spending generally. But it's a joint story. It's a complicated story.
But how much restraint are you actually imparting to the economy, would you say, relative to the neutral rate?
So I think it's of course, that it's not something you can identify with any precision. But a standard approach would be to take the nominal rate, 5.3%, let's say, and subtract sort of a forward measure of inflation. If you do that, and there are many, many ways to calculate the neutral rate, but that's one I like to do. And you're going to get to something that is materially above mainstream estimates of neutrality, of the neutral rate. You will. But at the same time, you look at the economy and you say, this is an economy that grew 3.1% last year. And you say, what does that tell you about the neutral rate? What's happening, though, is the supply side has been recovering in the middle of this. So that won't go on forever. So a lot of the growth we're seeing it isn't just a tug of war between interest rates and demand. You're getting, more activity because of labor market healing and supply chains healing. So I think the question is, when that peters out, I think the restriction will show up probably more sharply.
Rich.
Thank you. Sorry. Thanks for taking the questions, Mr. Chairman. You mentioned earlier we're not seeking a weaker labor market. I think you said. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Do you think the labor market now is back to quote unquote normal, and that we can achieve the inflation target without wage gains coming back down to what they were pre-pandemic? Even with today's ECI levels, they were still above those pre-pandemic levels.
I think the labor market, by many measures, is at or nearing normal, but not totally back to normal. And you pointed to one or more of them. So I think job openings are not quite back to where they were. Wage increases rather are not quite back to where they would need to be in the longer run. I would look at it this way, though. The economy is broadly normalizing, and so is the labor market. And that process will probably take some time. So wage setting is something that happens, it's probably will take a couple of years to get all the way back. And that's okay. That's okay. But we do see, you saw today's ECI reading, the evidence is that that wage increases are still at a healthy level, very healthy level, but they're gradually moving back to levels that would be more associated, given assumptions about productivity, are more typically associated with 2% inflation. It's an ongoing process, a healthy one, and I think we're moving in the right direction.
So that process can continue without a weakening of the labor market, basically, you're saying?
Well, I think the labor market is, I don't know if it's rebalancing. Clearly, there was a fairly severe imbalance between demand for workers and supply at the beginning of the pandemic. So we lost several million workers at the beginning of the pandemic from people dropping out of the labor force. And then when the economy reopened, you remember 2021, you had a severe labor shortage, and it was everywhere. The panic on the part of businesses couldn't find people. So what's happened is we expected the labor market to come back quickly, and it didn't. And 2022 was a disappointing year. And we were kind of thinking, well, maybe we won't get it back. And then 2023 we did, as you know. So labor force participation came back strongly in 23, and so did immigration. Immigration came to a halt during the pandemic. So those two forces have significantly lowered the temperature in the labor market to where it's still a very strong labor market. It's still a good labor market for wages and for finding a job, but it's getting back into balance. And that's what we want to see. And one great way to look at that is what's happening with wage increases. And you see it now across the major things that we track. It isn't every quarter, but overall there's a clear trend, still at high levels, but back down to where would be consistent with where we were before the pandemic and with 2% inflation.
Chris.
Hi, Chris Rugaber at Associated Press. Thank you. I wanted to follow up on Rich's question. It sounded like you suggested that you're not worried about faster growth so much. So wanted to see if you're seeing anything that suggests that inflation could re-accelerate from here. And it sounds like you're saying you're not worried that solid growth from here on out poses any risk to inflation. Thank you.
No, I think that is a risk, the risk that inflation would reaccelerate. I think the greater risk is that it would stabilize at a level meaningfully above 2%. That's to me more likely. Of course, if inflation were to surprise by moving back up, we would have to respond to that, and that would be a surprise at this point. But I have to tell you, that's why we keep our options open here, and why we're not, rushing. So I think both of those are risks, but I think the more likely risk is the one that I mentioned, which is you've had 6 good months, very good months, but what's really going to shake out here? When we look back, what will we see? Will inflation have dipped and then come back up? Are the last 6 months flattered by factors that are one-off factors that won't repeat themselves? We don't think so. We don't. That's not what we think. But that's the question we are asking. We have to ask, and we want to get comfort on that.
And just one quick follow-up. Governor Waller had mentioned the revisions that are coming on February 9th for the CPI data. Is that something you're watching as well? And if we see those revisions fairly minor, is that going to give you more confidence where things are going?
We'll just have to see. Yeah, we'll look at those. Last year was a surprise.
Michael McKee, Bloomberg Radio and Television. If you don't want to use the term soft landing, would you say at least that from your point of view now, the other scenario of a hard landing caused by the Fed is off the table, or the risks have diminished very much? And you mentioned below 2% inflation on a 3-month basis. Core PCE has been running at 1.5%. And there are those on Wall Street who think that if you maintain the level of restriction you have right now, you could end up with inflation running below your target. How do you see that?
So your first question, how to describe where we are. So I guess I would just say this. Executive summary would be that growth is solid to strong over the course of last year. The labor market, 3.7% unemployment, indicates that the labor market is strong. We've had just about 2 years now of unemployment under 4%. That hasn't happened in 50 years, so it's a good labor market. And we've seen inflation come down. We've talked about that. So we've got 6 months of good inflation data and an expectation that there's more to come. So this is a good situation. Let's be honest. This is a good economy. But what's the outlook? That's looking in the review. The outlook, we do expect growth to moderate. Of course, we have expected it for some time, and it hasn't happened. But we do expect that it will moderate as supply chain and labor market normalization runs its course. The labor market is rebalancing, as I mentioned. Job creation has slowed. The base of job growth has narrowed. And of course, 12-month inflation is above target and getting down closer to target. Is not guaranteed, but we do seem to be getting on track for that. So those are the risks and questions we have to answer. But overall, this is a pretty good picture. It is a good picture. Your second question was, sorry.
Could you get inflation that is below target, end up with inflation below target, and you have to do something about that?
So the thing is, we're not looking for inflation to tap the 2% base once. We're looking for it to settle out over time at 2%. And the same thing is true. If we have a month or two of lower, and we have that now, of inflation that's annualized at a lower level, that wouldn't be good. We're not looking to have inflation anchor below 2%. We're looking to have it anchor at 2%. So if we do face those circumstances, then we'll have to deal with that. I think as of now, the question, we want to take advantage of this situation and finish the job on inflation while keeping the labor market strong.
Edward.
Edward Lawrence from Fox Business. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for taking this. So as I've heard from some district Fed presidents, is it, in your view, a little premature to think that rate cuts are right around the corner? And then when we do see that first rate cut, should we interpret that as the beginning of a rate cut cycle, or is it a one-off?
So I'll point to that language on your first question. We included that language in the statement to signal clearly that with strong growth, strong labor market, inflation coming down, the committee intends to move carefully as we consider when to begin to dial back the restrictive stance that we have in place. So if you take that to the current context, we're going to be data dependent. We're going to be looking at this meeting by meeting. Based on the meeting today, I would tell you that I don't think it's likely that the committee will reach a level of confidence by the time of the March meeting to identify March as the time to do that, but that's to be seen. So I wouldn't call, when you ask me about in the near term, right, I'm hearing that as March. I would say I don't think it's probably not the most likely case or what we would call the base case. Then your second question is is this the start of when we see a cut, is it the start of a cutting cycle, or could it just be a one-off? That's going to depend on the data. The whole thing is this is going to depend on the data. We're going to be looking at the economic data as it affects the outlook and the balance of risks, and we're going to make our decisions based on that. And it could wind up, we'll have another SEP at the March meeting, and people will write down what they think. But in the end, it's really going to depend on how the economy evolves. We talked about there are risks that would cause us to go slower. For example, stronger inflation, more persistent inflation. There are risks that would cause us to, or if they happened, that would cause us to go faster and sooner, and that would be a weakening in the labor market, or for that matter, very, very persuasive lower inflation. Those are the kinds of things. So we're just going to be reacting to the data. That's really the only way we can do this.
Victoria.
Hi, Victoria Guido with Politico. Could you talk a little bit more about productivity growth? You've mentioned multiple times about the level of wage growth that's consistent with 2% inflation. We've obviously seen, you were talking about ECI this morning, in which it's cooled a little bit, but still sort of above what you wanted to see. Growth has been very strong. How much of those numbers do you attribute to productivity, and do you see that productivity as sort of just temporary because of the factors, the labor and supply chain factors you were talking about, or do you think that productivity growth will fade over time?
So this is a really interesting question, and I think my own view is, I think if you look back to the pandemic, you saw a spike in productivity as workers were laid off and activity didn't decline as fast. And then you saw a deep trough of productivity. And then over the last, you saw high productivity last year in 23. I think we're basically in the throes of getting through the pandemic economy. And the question will be, what is it that has changed? The productivity tends to be based on, fundamental aspects of our economy. Is there a case, will it be the case that we come out of this more productive, more on a sustained basis? And I don't know. What would it take? It would take, people talk about AI, but my guess is that we may shake out and be back where we were, because I'm not sure I see work from home doesn't seem like it's a big productivity increaser. AI, artificial intelligence, generative may be, but probably not in the short run, probably maybe in the longer run. So I'm not seeing why it would, but right now I would say the productivity is kind of what falls out of the broader forces that are driving people in and out of the labor force and activity returning and supply chains getting fixed.
Right. So would that be behind why we've seen such strong growth, but we've also seen inflation fall? That maybe there's just a higher level of productivity.
That's
right
one
now?
way to look at it. Yeah.
Nancy.
Hi, Chair Powell. Nancy Marshall-Genzer with Marketplace. I want to ask a little bit more about housing. I'm wondering, how closely are you watching rent and housing prices as you evaluate whether and when to cut rates? And it seems like housing prices are not coming down as quickly as you expected.
So when we think about, our statutory goals are maximum employment and price stability, and that's what we're targeting. We're not targeting housing price inflation, the cost of housing, or any of those things. Those are very important things for people's lives, but they're not, those are not the things we're targeting. We're also well aware that when we cut rates at the beginning of the pandemic, for example, the housing industry was helped more than any other industry. And when we raise rates, the housing industry can be hurt because it's a very interest-sensitive sector. On top of that, we have longer run problems with the availability of housing. We have a built-up set of cities, and people are moving further and further out, so there hasn't been enough housing built. And these are not things that we have any tools to address. But where it comes into play very specifically in our work is inflation, which is a combination. It's really rental inflation. You're taking owner's equivalent rent and then actual rent paid by tenants, and you're running that through the CPI calculation or the PCE calculation, the one we look at. And what that's telling you is that market rents are increasing at a much lower rate or even being flat, and that will show up in inflation over time. It has to, as long as that remains the case. So.
And just real quick, what is your response to the letter that was sent to you by some members of Congress asking the Fed to lower interest rates to make housing more affordable?
My response is what I started with, which is that our job, the job Congress has given us, is price stability and maximum employment. Price stability is absolutely essential for people's lives, most importantly, not most importantly, mostly for people at the lower end of the income spectrum who are living at the edges, at the margins. And so for someone like that, high inflation in the necessities of life, right away you're in trouble. Whereas even middle class people have some scope to absorb higher costs. So we have to get, it's our job, it's what society has asked us to do, is to get inflation down, and the tools that we use to do it are interest rates. So that's how we think about that.
Courtney Brown from Axios. Can you give us some insight into whether the committee discussed the possibility of slowing balance sheet runoff in the months ahead?
Yes. So I would start by saying that balance sheet runoff so far has gone very well. And as the process has continued, we're getting to that time where questions are beginning to come into greater focus about the pace of runoff and all that. So at this meeting, we did have some discussion of the balance sheet, and we're planning to begin in-depth discussions of balance sheet issues at our next meeting in March. So those questions are all coming into scope now, and we're focusing on them, but we're at the beginning of that process, I would say.
Quick follow-up, is it the case that the Fed would decide to lower rates and make adjustments to the balance sheet runoff in tandem?
Yes, we do. We see those as independent tools, and so they don't. For example, if you're normalizing policy, you might be reducing rates but continuing to run off the balance sheet. In both cases, that's normalization. But from a strict monetary policy standpoint, you could say we're loosening and one with tightening. So that could happen. It's not something we're planning or thinking about, but right now we're thinking about getting to a place where we're going to see the balance sheet run off to continue. We're watching it carefully, and as I said, we'll be looking into that as a committee starting in March.
Thanks.
Simon Urbanovich with The Economist. Thank you, Chair Powell. You've mentioned 6 good months of inflation data, but that not being enough to build up confidence. Based on your previous response that your base case is you probably wouldn't start easing yet in March, the implication is that 8 good months might not be enough either. Roughly how many months do you think you might need of good inflation data to be confident?
Yeah, I'm not in a position to put a number on it. I'm just going to say, it's not that we don't have any confidence. We have growing confidence, but not to the point where we feel like it's a highly consequential decision to start the process of dialing back on restriction, and we want to get that right. And we feel like the strong economy, strong labor market, inflation coming down, it gives us the ability to do that. We think that's the best way we can serve the public, because ultimately we've made a lot of progress on inflation. We just want to make sure that we do get the job done in a sustainable way. That's how we're thinking about it. In terms of when that'll be, that'll all come out of our communications, and we won't keep that a secret.
Hi, Chair Powell. Evan Reiser with M&I Market News. Can you explain a little bit more on what you're considering when tapering QT? Do you need to see the overnight reverse repo facility all the way down to zero, or is it something that you can start with a couple $100 billion there?
Not a decision that we've made, but I wouldn't think we wouldn't be taking a position that it's got to go to zero. I mean, if it were to stabilize at a different level, but that's not a decision that we've made. That's what we'll be talking about at the March meeting. A whole range of issues will be briefed up, and the committee will get into all of the issues that will be arising over the course of the next, let's say, year or so.
Greg. Thanks, Greg Robb from MarketWatch. Chair Powell, I want to change gears a little bit. In the presidential primary campaign that's been going on for the last 9 months or so, your name has come up often, and many Republican candidates had said that they probably wouldn't want to give you a third term. So I wanted to give you a chance to talk about that. Do you want another term? You've had on the Fed. What's your stance on that?
I don't have a stance on that. It's not something I'm focused on. Focused on doing our jobs. This year is going to be a highly consequential year for the Fed and for monetary policy, and we're all of us very buckled down, focused on doing our jobs.
Jennifer. Thank you, Chair Powell. Jennifer Schonberger with Yahoo Finance. As you mentioned, core PCE has been running at 1.9% over the past 6 months, and you guys are actually expecting core inflation higher this year at 2.4% compared to that 6-month measure. Given that forecast and that the median is for 3 rate cuts this year, what happens if inflation stays where it's been over the last 6 months for the next 6 months?
So we'll update our inflation forecasts at the next meeting. You referred to the December meeting. That's 3 months old, so it might be lower now given the data we've gotten. So look, as I mentioned, we're going to be reacting to the data. If we get very strong inflation data and it kicks back up, then we'll go slower or later or both. If we got really good inflation data soon, that would matter for both that would tell us that we could go sooner and perhaps go faster. So we're just going to be, but of course we'll weigh that with all the other factors. We're setting policy based on the totality of the data.
But just to follow, if inflation stays where it is currently, that would probably mean that the real interest rate becomes more restrictive. Would that mean you'd have to trim more, perhaps, than you already have factored in?
Well, I think if we came to the view that that the 6-month inflation numbers, which are very close to 2, were in PCE world, if we thought that is really where we're going to be, then yes, our policy would be in a different place. It would. But that's the whole point, is we're trying to get comfortable and gain confidence that inflation is on a sustainable path down to 2% or toward 2%.
Daniel.
Hi, Chair Powell. Daniel Davis, Agence France-Presse. I just wondered if I could get your comment on the recent consumer confidence data. It seems to suggest that consumers are sort of moving towards a much more optimistic view of the economy. I just wonder, is it fair to say that they're moving towards where the Fed appears to have been in recent months? And do you think that inflation and falling inflation perhaps has played a role in that? And what challenges do you see going forward? Thank you.
Yeah, so it's been interesting that confidence surveys have been weak at a time when unemployment has been low, very low, historically low for a couple of years, but nonetheless that's been the case. And we've asked ourselves why that is, and one obvious answer, we don't pretend to have perfect wisdom on this, but one obvious answer is that the price level is high. So prices went up much more than 2% per year for a couple of years, and people are going to the store and they're paying much more for the basics of life than they were 2 years ago, 3 years ago, and they're not happy about it. And it's fine that inflation's coming down, but the prices they're paying are still high. So that is what that has to be some part of why people are unhappy, and they're right to be unhappy. This is why we need to keep price stability. It's why we need to do our jobs, is so that people don't have to deal with things like this. In terms of you're right. In recent surveys, you've seen a couple of significant increases in consumer confidence or happiness with the economy. I guess that's a good thing. That can support spending, can support economic activity. There's some evidence of that. But it is a fact that we have seen a meaningful increase. I think levels of confidence are still maybe not as high as they've been at various times, but they certainly have come up.
Thank you for taking our questions. Brian Menace, CNN Business. Committee members have said they'd like to meet with business leaders and stakeholders in person to learn more about the economy in real time, given that some data are subject to large revisions, the issue of seasonal adjustments being thrown off balance, and many readings of the economy being quarterly. So did any members say they've learned anything not yet reflected in the data, or have you yourself learned anything through anecdotal evidence that hasn't been captured in the data yet?
Well, yes. I'm a big believer that yes. So we do meet with outside groups who come from all different parts of the economy, and I always feel like I spent most of my life in the private sector looking at companies, individual management teams, and then building out from that. And so starting with GDP data and working into what's actually affecting people's lives is challenging. It's very hard. So I really like anecdotal data. In addition, as you know, the 12 reserve banks have really the best network of anyone. That in all their districts, they're talking to, not just the business community, but the educational, medical, nonprofit community. They have arms into all of that. And so when they come back, that's what goes into the beige book. But they come back, and what each Reserve Bank president does is, during the Outlook go-around, they'll say, in my district, and they'll talk about 100 conversations. They won't talk up. They will give you input based on 100 conversations that they've had with people of all different walks. And I personally find it very helpful in understanding what's going on. And also, I think you hear things before they show up in the data sometimes.
Did any of them notice slowing economy based on what they've heard from their district?
Yes. I mean, if you look back at the last, not this beige book, but the one before, there was a lot of slower activity. I think that what you're hearing now is things are picking up a bit. You're hearing, not in every district and not every person that we talk to, but you're overall, it feels like you're hearing things picking up at the margin. So that's what comes through.
Go to Jeff Cox for the last question.
Thank you, sir. Jeff Cox from CNBC.com. Just kind of looking to put it all together. You talked about basically the economy looking strong with 3.3% annualized growth in the fourth quarter. Does the strength of the economy speak more loudly to you now than any inflation threat might? That you're in a position, in other words, to keep rates elevated as long as the economy stays strong, and you're more tilted towards that. And also, perhaps, are you worried at all that the economy is maybe a little too strong right now and that inflation could come back at some point?
I'm not so worried about that. It's again, we've had inflation come down without a slow economy and without important increases in unemployment, and there's no reason why we should want to get in the way of that process if it's going to continue. So I think declining inflation, continued declines in inflation, are really the main thing we're looking at. Of course, we want the labor market to remain strong too. We don't have a growth mandate. We've got a maximum employment mandate and a price stability mandate, and those are the two things we look at. Growth only matters to the extent it influences our achievement of those two mandates.
No. Dobrze. Skončil konečne. To bola normálne, dneska to bolo des a hrúza, takže toto môžem celé vypnúť. Áno, milenky, dobře. Upneteme si bitcoiník a uvidíme, že či tam vôbec niečo uvidíme. Dobře, tak ako som spomínal už, dnes porod, bolo to ešte horšie ako porod, by som povedal. Veľa žien by mi to asi uznalo. Nie, jasné, že porod je tá najhoršia vec. Alebo teda najlepšia vec, ale najťažšia vec pre ženy. Dobre. Poďme teda na to. Čiže takto vyzerá zatiaľ s marketom. Na S&P 500 market mini korekcia, nič extrémne. Hej, S&P 500 market má proste na weekly time frame fakt, že dosť veľa pozitíva. Čo sa týka Bitcoinu, takisto, hej, žiadna story sa tu zatiaľ teda nepíše, čo sa Bitcoinu týka. Žiadne veľké očakávania sa tu teda neudiali. Sme náspäť pri tej, alebo teraz sme stále uzatvorení medzi 43 800 a 44 000 dolárov, až tá spodná hodnota, čo je supportovka zatiaľ teda na weekly 41 000 a 40 500 dolárov. Čiže toto je naša range medzi na weekly timeframe, nič sa tu príliš veľmi nemení. Ďalšia supportová línia je 38 a potom tie hodnoty 31 000 dolárov. Myslím si, že čím budeme vidieť, alebo teda stále tu môžeme mať ešte tlak na to, aby sme fakt, že padali k tým hodnotám 38 200 dolárov až 30 700 dolárov. To je stále ešte možné a aktuálne, stačí, aby prišla nejaká negatívna správa, alebo teda aspoň market, aby si myslel, že je niečo brutálne negatívne a oni to tam môžu šupnúť s tým, že keď sa spojí taká perfektná búrka, hej, že GBTC bude ďalej odpredávať, miner budú ďalej odpredávať a do toho sa zapojí ešte nejaký FAT správa a vznikne tam panika retaileru, tak môže nás to potiahnuť smerom dole. Celkovo z dlhodobého hľadiska je to do strany a hore, tak ako niekto napísal a proste takto to treba brať. Hej. Tie korekcie už, alebo teda na nejaký veľký dumpolu party sa určite netreba pozerať a radšej pripravovať sa na tie pozitíva, ktoré môže zažiť Bitcoin. Hej, po meetingu žiadne katastrofálne veci ani žiadne odpaľovacie správy neboli. Čo sa týka prerázenia 47 000, to si myslím, že môže byť v pohode aj pred halvingom. Nie je tam dôvod, že prečo by to takto nemalo byť. Všetko to bude závisieť práve od nie GBTC, ale práve od toho, že ako sa bude dariť tým najväčším lídrom kumulovať bitcoiny, alebo teda bitcoiny, hej, do svojich ETF-ov. Čiže keď sa pozrieme na dáta a keď sa pozrieme na správy, tak jednoznačne vidno, že zatiaľ teda BlackRock, ako si môžete všimnúť, kedy som robil? Včera som robil video, bolo 51 000, 51 000. Teraz má Fidelity 53 800, čiže skoro 54 000 bitcoinov na svojej súvahe a iBit má necelých 57 500 dolárov. Čiže hej, tieto čísla budú odpaľovať celý market. Plus rastú aj tieto sračky, ktoré príliš veľmi nepozeráme. Čiže hej, toto budú lídry a ako môžete si všimnúť, zatiaľ majú oveľa rýchlejšie tempo smerom hore, než má GBTC smerom dole. To ináč nie je príliš veľmi príjemná správa. Ja by som bol radšej, ak by sme pomaličky dumpovali a ak by to bol väčší tlak a udržiavaný tlak práve tých predajcov. Jednak by sme mohli nakúpiť za nižšie hodnoty, ale celkovo hej, by to tempo možno bolo oveľa rýchlejšie, ak by sme zažili nejakú tú korekciu, lebo teraz to zatiaľ teda jednoznačne bíci trošička udržiavajú. FTT pada ako kameň, nech padne ako kameň, lebo oznámili, že nebude spustená FTX 2, čo sa dalo očakávať a čo prakticky povedali je, že iný zaujímavý projekt to bude, je, že niekde tu mám tú správu aj vyťahnutú, lebo tých správ prišlo celkovo dosť, len som to nestihol. FTX, hej, vyplatí všetkých klientov. Som zvedavý, v akých percentách, som zvedavý, že čo to vlastne príde a že nebudú spúšťať FTX 2.0. Tí klienti nedostanú peniaze tak skoro a môžeme to vidieť práve na tom príklade od iných ľudí, hej, ktorí ešte mali burzu a nevyplatili od 2014 ľudí. Dobre, čiže zatiaľ žiadne zmeny, zajtra update na tej 12-hodinovke, pokiaľ sa držíme nad hodnotou 42 200, je to úplne v pohode. Ak príde prepad cez 42 200, tak potom môžeme čakať targety na 40 700. Na 45 minútovke a tu na mierne negatívne naladené, ale nič katastrofa. Nechcel som, keďže tam niekto rozprával, že nemám do toho rozprávať. Veľmi pekný pattern tu na bol. Krásne otestovanie 200, otestovanie poslednej úrovne 300, ja našťastie som stále ešte v pozíciách, keďže mi to nepíplo a následne krásne zrútenie. Čiže čo sa týka rezistencia je teraz jednak na tých hodnotách 200, ale skôr by som očakával tú hodnotu 43 200 dolárov, čiže to je to isté, čo sme mali prakticky ráno. Čiže máme tu tú hodnotu rezistencie 43 200, následne separtovka 42 700 až hodnota 42 600 a následne ďalšia úroveň, čo sa týka týka 15 minútovky, tak bude 42 200, hej. Čiže toto sú úrovne, na ktoré si určite hoďte očko. Na Patreone nájdete viac vecí. Patreoni, zajtra mi pripomeňte, že vám mám ukázať nejakú vec, čo sa indikátoru týka. Možno to neukážem, pokiaľ to nebudeme mať poriadne rozbehnuté, alebo vám ho pustím a proste si ho testujte sami, ja si ho budem testovať takisto. Čiže uvidíme, že ako to budete vlastne chcieť. Dobre, čiže ďakujem veľmi pekne všetkým, ktorí prišli na tento daný kanál a na tento livestream. Tieto livestreamy sú také, aké sú, hej, proste hovorím, je to také, aké je to, proste ja to nevymýšľam, tie FOMCčka, je to, stále to bola nuda, stále to je nuda. Pokiaľ nebudeme počuť pivot, tak žiadne zmeny tam asi nemôžeme príliš veľmi od toho očakávať. Dobre, taký recap, čo sa prakticky stalo, je, že mali sme FOMC meeting, zástupcovia Fedu sa zhodli na tom, že nebudú navyšovať úrokové sadzby, čiže tie úrokové sadzby ostanú na 525 bazických bodov až 550 bazických bodov. S marketom to vôbec nespravilo nič. Mali sme tu mini volatilitu, čo sme celkovo aj očakávali. Bitcoin bol na hodnotách rezistencie a tie rezistencie ho poslali dole na tú supportovú hodnotu. A ešte jedna vec zaujímavá, na celú tú hodinu, čo tam rozprával Ujo Powell, tak len jedna vec tam padla zaujímavá otázka, a to je od pána Plešatého, ktoré neviem, jak sa volal, ale proste povedal, niečo narážal na úrokové sadzby a Powell povedal, že neočakávame príliš veľmi, že budeme v marci znižovať úrokové sadzby, čiže vtedy, hej, prišla palička smerom dole a sklamanie možno marketu, že proste každý už očakával, že na ďalšom FOMC meetingu budú znižovať sadzby, čo nie je pravda a je tam veľmi malá pravdepodobnosť, aspoň teda podľa rétoriky Powella, ako to povedal, že tam asi nebude úplne všetko také, ako si veľa traderov a investorov myslí. Čiže toto je taký ten recap. Po katastrofálnej hodine a pol sme tam mali jednu zaujímavú odpoveď. A jednu zaujímavú otázku, jednu zaujímavú odpoveď, kedy fakt, že aj trošička na to zareagoval market, lebo zvyšný čas bol taký, že kebyže nemám otvorený autobázar, tak to asi tu fakt, že zaspím. Dobre, ďakujem veľmi pekne, že ste prišli na tento daný kanál. Ak môžete, určite rozkopte ten like button, lebo stále mi to pomôže v tom, aby sme napredovali. A my sa vidíme v ďalšom videu. Pomaličky tradujte, užívajte si a prajem vám zatiaľ veľmi pekný zvyšok večera.